Hey guys, so in this video we will be going to see how we can store data to the IPFS as well as how we can upload files to the IPFS, and then we will try to download those files from the IPFS. So for this implementation I am using NodeJS as my backend service, and on the NodeJS side we will be going to use ipfs-http-client library in order to store and download those files. So let's start by creating a directory here. mkdir ipfs example. And let me open this directory into my VS Code. And now let's try to initialize the project, Node.js project. So for this, let's do npm i. npm init-y. Okay, now let's create a simple file, app.js. There it is, and we will be going to use ipfs-http client. So let's install that library first. So let's do npm i ipfs-http. Okay, so our library has been installed successfully, and now we can start on the implementation part. So let me just close this, and now let's try to write the code here. So let's require the library first. Or instead, let's import the partial create function. Just import the create function, and we will be going to create the IPFS client. So let's create the client IPFS equals to await create. And since we are using this await keyword, so we will wrap this into a function. So let's create a function. I will call it as main. And inside this function, I am going to keep this code. And let's make this function as async function. Great. So now our IPFS client is created, but here we need to pass the our host name, our IPFS node. So if you are using local installation of IPFS, then you can provide your local IPFS details. But since I'm going to use the remote node, IPFS node, so I'm going to provide the remote host name in the port. So here let's give the host as infura dot let's give the host as ipfs.infura.io. infura.io, and let's provide the port as 5001. And now let's define the protocol as well. The protocol is HTTPS. So our IPFS client is ready now. And now let's do one thing. Let's return this, so that we can have separate functions where we are going to use this IPFS to store the file as well as for storing the text data. So let's return this, return IPFS, and let's call this as IPFS client. Okay, let's refactor this. Great. Now, so now our IPFS client is ready. Now we can create one function which is going to store the data to the IPFS, and this data is going to be a text data. So let's create a function I'm going to create an async function. Async function save text. And here I need the instance of IPFS client. So I'm simply going to call this function. So let IPFS equals to await IPFS client. And now I can simply write the add function of this IPFS client in order to store the text data. So I'm going to do IPFS dot add, and here we can pass our data, like what data we want to store onto the IPFS node. So for now, let's store the text data as hello, and this is going to return a promise, so we can use await here. And let's store the result into some data, into some variable. Now let's do console of this, console.log result. Let's see what we get inside the result. Great. So now let's call this thing. Let's call this save function, save text. Save text. We have called the save text, and now let's try to run this. So I'm going to clear my terminal, and let's run node app.js. Great. So you can see we got some data. We got the path, we got the CID, as well as we got the size of data that we have written. So now let's try to see this data from the browser first, and then we will going to do the implementation of this in the Node.js as well. Like by providing up this hash, content hash, we are going to get the actual data. So now let's try to give the content of this this hash, like what actual content is there. So in order to do that, let's open the browser and let's see there. So here is a browser, and we have to visit this site, which is ipfs.io/ipfs, and then slash, and then here you have to put the hash here, the hash that you got when you saved the text to the IPFS. So just pass the text, and there we can see we got the text that we stored onto the IPFS through our Node.js code. Let's try to run this example a couple of times. Let's try to add some data like welcome, and let's give the today's date as well. So do this in this way. Now let's try to run this again. We got that hash here, and now if I do Control-C, just copy this, and let me just update this hash here. Let's try to see the content. There you see, we successfully got the data that we have written to the IPFS node. And now let's try to save the files onto the IPFS as well. Let's try to save the file. So in order to save the file, what we can do is, let me just comment down this function, and let's create a different function for storing up these files to the IPFS. So let's start using this way. Let me create a simple function save file, and let me create this function as a async function. And here let's write the code for getting up the IPFS client. Let IPFS equal to IPFS client, and now we can use this IPFS client in order to save the file. So the function is going to be same, but the parameters that we are going to pass this time to this function are going to be different. So here we have to put the give the file path. So what path, basically the name of the file that we want to keep as an entry onto the IPFS node. So let's call this as abc.text, and here I want to store some data. Let's say I want to store some data, so we have to pass the data to this content property, and here I can give the data as hello ipfs. Let's keep the reference of this into one variable. Let result equal to await ipfs.add, and then the path, and then the content. Now let's try to see what we get inside this result. Console.log result, and let's try to run this again. So before, we have to call this function as well, save file. Now let's run this. Okay, so this time you can see we got the path as abc.txt, and then we got this hash value as well. Let's copy this and go to the browser, and there let's try to see the content. So there we can see that we got the data as hello ipfs. Let's do this. Let's try to play more with this adding file functionality, because adding text is very straightforward. You pass the text to this function, and then you get the result where you can basically you get the hash, and then you can store that hash to the ipfs. You can basically get the data using that ipfs hash. So now let's try to play with this more around. So now let's try to store one JSON file to the ipfs node. So let's do one thing. Let's create one file. I will call this ipfs.json, and here let me pass the JSON string. So for passing up the JSON, let's create the JSON data first. So let's do this here. Let data equal to, and here we can create our JSON object. So let's try to create a simple object. I can give name as Aditya, age as, let's say, some 20, and then or let's give the sex as male. Now let's try to store this here, and so we have to do json.stringify as well. Okay, so this is fine. Now let me just clear up this terminal, and let's try to run this. Great, so we get this path value as well as the CID content hash. Just copy this, and let's try to run this, view this file here. So this file application takes some time. That's why it takes some time to load this file, because it is syncing up with other nodes as well. There we can see we got the data that we stored onto the ipfs. Let's play some more with this. Let me just clear my terminal, and let me just hide this so that you can see the entire code as well. So this was the function. This is the function to create the ipfs client. Then we wrote one function which is to save the text, and now this is the function in which we are working, that is for storing of the data, storing of the file to the ipfs. Let's do one more thing. Let's create one options property here. Basically, let me show you like why I'm creating that options property. And inside the options, let's do this wrap with directory. Wrap with directory to true, and then let's write one function here as well, progress function. Basically, this function will return us the progress, like how much % the file has been uploaded. Console.log, we can just log this progress variable. Okay, now we can pass that object here. Here we can pass that options, and now let's try to run this again. So here we can see the progress here as well, and then we can see this thing. And the interesting thing is that see carefully this thing, that when we ran this script last time, we got the hash, and if I open this hash on the browser, you can just remember the last 4 characters here, DUJR. And if I go to the browser, last time also we got the same hash. If you see, we got the hash that is ending with DUJR. So why we got the same hash every time, even though we ran the script 2 times? So the reason for getting up the same hash is because the IPFS works on content hashing. So our content was same both the times, like the previously when we run the script, and this time also the content was same. So that's why it gave us the same hash value. So now let's try to run this thing. See, we got the same data. So now let's do one thing. Let's try to retrieve the data as well. Let's create a simple function which is going to give us the data from just by passing up this content hash ID. So I can do function get data, and let's make this as an async function. As always, let's get the IPFS client, and then we can do IPFS dot get here, and here we can pass this ID, this hash ID, or let's do this thing. Let's pass this from here, hash. Let's keep this as a parameter, and we can call this function get data from here. We can pass this hash from there. So now the response that this function is going to return is that async iteratable. So we have to just process this data as well. So I'm calling this as async itr, and here we have to process this thing. So I'm going to run a for loop on this iterator. So const itr of async itr, here, and we have to just make this as await. Let me just format the code here. Now what we can do is we can just read the data. Like we can just do console.itr first, and let's see what is inside this itr. Just format this code. Now let's run this. Let's verify if the previous function is commented. Yes, so it is commented. Now we can run this. Node app.js. So you see, we got the data, but the data is in the buffer format. So now let's try to convert this buffer data into string and then process it. So we can do buffer dot from, and from we have to pass the iterator, and then we can do toString. And let's store this into a variable. Let me call this as data, and we don't need this console statement. We can do the console here, console.log data. Let's try to run this. We got some data, but additionally we got some hash values also. So now let's try to fix this as well. So the better way of fixing this is, instead of doing ipfs.get, we can do just ipfs.cat here, And now let's try to run this. Everything is going to be same. So there you can see we got the data here as well, the JSON data, and then you can process it further. Like if you want to store this somewhere like onto the file or onto the database, you can just do that part. So if you want to store the file from your file system as well, you can do the same in this save file function as well. All you have to do is you have to just read the file from the you can store the file to the IPFS. So let me show you that how you can do that. Let's create that data variable here, and let's import the fs if you want to store the if you want to access the local file system. So const fs equal to require fs. Now let's do fs.read file sync, and here we can pass our file. So let's see what we have in the current directory. So we have these many files. So let's try to store this package.json onto the IPFS. So I have to give the path package.json, path of that file. Okay, and then we should be good to go. So let me create this as wrap directory to false, because I don't want to have any kind of directory. I just want to simply store that file. And let's format this code. Let's comment this function and let's call this save file function. Let's run this. So if I just copy this hash, so you see that this time we got the different hash. So the hash value will be dependent on the content that you are passing. If you are passing the content that is already available onto the IPFS, then you will always get the same hash. But if the content is unique, then you will be going to get a different hash. So let's copy this and move to the browser. Let's try to access this here. So for the first time it takes time because it has to retrieve the file from the other IPFS node as well. So here you can see we got the data, but this is in the bytes format. So like on the NodeJS side, we can just process it as well. Or one thing we can do is, instead of passing this like here, like in the form of file, we can just pass the data directly. Then it should be stored directly onto the IPFS node without any file name. So let's just copy this. There you can see we got the data in the JSON format. So that's all for this video. The source code you can find in the description. I will put the GitHub repository link, and then you can explore this this library, this particular library, HTTP-client, according to your requirement. And if you want to see such type of content, then please subscribe to the channel.